This is How America Was Stolen, Episode 18. As the blueprint of conquest spread from colony to colony, so did something else. Something the settlers never planned for. Memory Native nations remembered what happened in Virginia. They remembered the lies, the broken treaties, the starvation wars, and the villages burned in the name of security. And as settlers pushed outward, those memories began to connect across regions like sparks jumping from fire to fire. This episode is where resistance stops being local and starts becoming regional. This is the moment Native nations began to understand that they were not facing separate colonies, but a single expanding force. And for the first time since contact, many decided to rise together. Along the rivers and forests of the Northeast, tribes who had once competed with one another began holding councils. Messengers traveled long distances, carrying warnings and stories of settler violence. They spoke of lands taken, of diseases spreading behind settler lines, of treaties used as traps. The message was clear. What happened to them will happen to us. This realization changed everything. Instead of reacting after land was taken, Native leaders began planning ahead. They mapped settler routes. They watched new towns rise. They tracked supply lines and learned the settlers' weaknesses. The land itself became a weapon. Settlers were still confident. They believed Native resistance was scattered and temporary. They believed superior weapons guaranteed victory. But they misunderstood one crucial truth. Native nations had survived for thousands of years without empires, without kings, without standing armies. Yet they understood strategy, patience, and survival better than any colonist. And now, they were sharing that knowledge across borders. In the forests of New England, alliances formed to push back against Puritan expansion. In the South, tribes regrouped and fortified their villages. Along the frontier, Native warriors launched coordinated strikes against isolated settlements, forts, and patrols. These attacks were not random. They were intentional. They were timed. They were warnings. Settlers were forced to travel in groups. Farms were abandoned. Outposts collapsed. Colonial leaders suddenly realized something terrifying. Expansion was no longer easy. What followed was a cycle that would define centuries. Settlers pushed into native land. Native alliances resisted. Colonies retaliated with overwhelming force. Land was taken. Resistance adapted. Round after round. Generation after generation. And every time Native nations resisted, the settlers used that resistance to justify harsher laws, larger militias, and more aggressive land seizures. The truth was twisted again and again. European governments responded by militarizing the colonies even further. Soldiers were sent not just to protect towns, but to escort settlers into contested land. Forts multiplied. Roads were cut through native territory, not for trade, but for control. All roads made invasion easier, and yet, native nations refused to disappear quietly. Parents taught their children who they were. Elders passed down stories of land before fences. Warriors trained, knowing they were fighting not just for themselves, but for generations they might never see. Survival itself became resistance. Episode 18 reveals a truth often erased from history books. Native people were not passive victims swept aside by fate. They fought, they organized, they adapted, they resisted again and again, even when the odds were impossible. The settlers did not inherit America peacefully. They fought for it, against people who never surrendered it willingly. But resistance has a cost. As alliances grew stronger, colonial retaliation grew more brutal. Settlers began targeting entire nations for the actions of a few. Villages were erased to send messages. Fear was used deliberately to break unity. And slowly, the war entered a new phase, one where survival would require sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. In Episode 19, the conflict escalates again as one of the bloodiest colonial wars in early American history begins, changing everything that comes after.